Hello everybody, hope you're doing well. Tonight's presentation is on the subject of racial purity. This came up when DNA reports confirmed that Europeans have Neanderthal admixture, whereupon certain Afrocentrist groups started making the claim that black people are the most pure human. The reality, though, is much more complicated. Let's go back in time. During my lifetime, we were still relying on the 19th century single-track conception of evolution. Darwin wouldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams that modern humans are actually hybrids from a number of different proto-hominid ancestors. That theory arose later in the early 20th century when physical anthropologists like Carlton Kuhn dug up the skeletons and noticed suspicious similarities between Europeans and Neanderthal man, or between the sub-Saharan Africans and Homo erectus. They started to realize that what we perceive as racial traits didn't come about through evolution, but through crossbreeding with pre-existing proto-hominids. Kuhn was adamant that the hybridization he saw happened too fast for evolution to explain it. The changes were within a generation or two, not tens of thousands of years. The quick morphological changes were powerful indicators of crossbreeding. This was the strategy that modern humans employed to acquire new traits, enabling them to adapt to environments not through the glacial process of natural selection, but through the quickie method of breeding with earlier proto-hominids. But to the 19th century mind, a mind affected by institutional racism, the idea of humans breeding with other proto-hominids was thought crime. Impossible. No human worth his salt would breed with a lesser race. Then DNA came out. Now we know for a fact that Europeans have between 2 to 4% Neanderthal nuclear DNA. Sub-Saharan Africans do indeed show traces of Homo erectus, and now Asians and Australoid groups show traces of the Denisovans, while Indonesians are starting to look suspiciously bred with Homo florenziensis. This multi-regional development hypothesis, bolstered now by DNA, shows a very sloppy process. Not a single missing link ancestor, but dozens of different subraces coexisting in prehistory and interbreeding. Darwin imagined this clean, single straight line, and as it turns out, he was wrong. But let's go back and examine things as they stood before the age of DNA technology, when all they had to go on was bones and skeletal structures. Just based on things like skulls and teeth, physical anthropologists started to notice that modern Europeans, for example, had a bunch of traits in common with Neanderthals. For instance, Neanderthal man had pink skin, freckles, blue eyes, and red hair. And here's a map of where Neanderthal lived. Notice that wherever Neanderthal didn't exist, these traits are largely non-existent in modern populations. But it was more than just superficial things like coloring. Neanderthal and modern Europeans had nearly identical teeth. Neanderthal teeth are more similar, for instance, to a modern Frenchman's than the Frenchman's are to a Kenyan's. They had similar bones in the hand as well, which separate them from the rest of the human family. They had certain skull features in common, like the occipital bun. Here's the occipital bun on the Neanderthal skull. Here's the occipital bun on the back of a modern European's head. This trait, mostly found among Atlantic coast Europeans, is absent in about 97% of the rest of the human race. Here's a modern reconstruction of Neanderthal. Anthropologists were struck by the fact that these features show up in the oldest European populations as well. The oldest type? It's called the Baird type, and it appears in Spain and France, and one of its exemplars would be actor Jose Ferrer, for instance. See him here. Note how similar his broad nose and sloping chin are to Neanderthals who lived in the same region of Spain where Mr. Ferrer's ancestors were from. Needless to say, the occipital bun is extremely common in this region of Spain, and it's one of the things that first got anthropologists wondering. As I said before, according to the multi-regional development theory, traits that we perceive as racial traits are increasingly being seen as actually being leftovers from crossbreeding with different proto-hominid groups. So Europeans, who crossbred with Neanderthal, picked up a bunch of his traits. This is why Europeans look markedly different than, say, Australian Aborigines. The Australian Aborigine picked up traits from a group that we call the Denisovans. According to DNA analysis, we know that the Denisovans had extremely dark, almost black skin, for instance. And what a coincidence. Australian Aborigines and Melanesians who bred with the Denisovans have black skin. But it's more than just a single superficial trait like that. The borrowings we're discovering are extensive. Modern Kenyans, according to DNA tests, have no Neanderthal or Denisovan admixture. There's growing evidence, however, that Kenyans may not be purely human either. Like Europeans and Australian Aborigines, they're modern human plus proto-hominid, except in their case it's probably Homo erectus. Paleontologists have long noted that the earliest modern human skulls did not look like modern black people. They had cranial measurements and dentition more similar to modern Mediterranean populations. So when did what we think of as black people come about? That's the controversial part that physical anthropologists have noted back in the 1910s. What they noted was that in the earliest levels, ancient modern humans looked more or less proto-Caucasoid, like this. Then, where modern humans overlapped with Homo erectus, you got populations that suddenly started looking very Homo erectoid. Here's Homo erectus. Compare him to actor Don Cheadle. Here's an article, by the way, from Discover magazine and preliminary tests from sub-Saharan Africans suggesting that Homo erectus did indeed provide DNA material to modern sub-Saharan Africans. So what we're discovering more and more is that the physical anthropologists who were led to the theory sheerly on skeletal similarities and skull resemblances were probably right. What we perceive as racial traits probably weren't due to evolutionary factors as crossbreeding with various proto-hominids around the world. Physical anthropologist Carlton Kuhn in particular was adamant that the changes he documented happened too rapidly to be accounted for by parallel evolution. You'll typically hear this hypothesis. Modern humans started to look like their neighboring proto-hominids because they occupied similar terrain. Over thousands of generations evolving under the same conditions, they'd start to develop parallel traits. The thing is, according to Kuhn, we weren't seeing slow changes over thousands of generations. You'd see the two groups overlap, and within a few short generations, you'd see hybrids. That implied crossbreeding, not parallel evolution. And now the DNA has weighed in. Kuhn was right. Australian Aborigines look different from Norwegians because Australian Aborigines have Denisovan traits, while a Norwegian would look heavily influenced by a Neanderthal. Actor Don Cheadle looks different from a Japanese because his ancestors in the distant past probably crossbred with Homo erectus. In other words, we're all mixed, just with different proto-hominids. So when Afrocentrists or white nationalists tell you that they're the representative of the real human, you'll know how full of nonsense they are. We're all mixed, and we're all part caveman. Some of us are just going to have to take a little bit longer to deal with it.